I am Jerusalem.
Jerusalem, a city steeped in history, sacred to three of the world's great religions. For centuries, empires have clashed for control of this holy land, its fate hanging in the balance between East and West. And in the heart of this tumultuous history, a unique kingdom arose, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, forged in the fires of the First Crusade. For millennia, the land we call the Holy Land has been a crossroads of civilization. From the ancient empires of Mesopotamia and Egypt to the rise of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, its strategic location and profound religious significance have made it a prize worth fighting for. In the 11th century, a powerful religious and political movement swept across Europe, igniting the First Crusade. Driven by a fervent desire to wrest control of the Holy Land from Muslim rule, tens of thousands of European Christians answered the call to arms. After a grueling journey and brutal battles, the Crusaders achieved the unthinkable. They captured Jerusalem in 1099. The city, soaked in the blood of both defenders and attackers, became the cornerstone of a new Christian kingdom, a fragile outpost in a hostile world. From the ashes of conquest rose the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a feudal state ruled by European nobles. This was no ordinary kingdom. It was a land where knights and barons from France, England, and Germany ruled over a diverse population of Muslims, Jews, and Eastern Christians. Life in the Kingdom of Jerusalem was a tapestry woven from contrasting threads. The Frankish elite brought their own customs and laws, but they also had to adapt to the realities of ruling in a foreign land. They built imposing castles to defend their territory, forged alliances with local rulers, and developed a complex relationship with the powerful Byzantine Empire. Trade flourished, bringing wealth and exotic goods from the east to the west. Pilgrims from across Europe journeyed to the Holy City, drawn by the power of the holy sites now under Christian control. Yet, beneath the surface of this vibrant kingdom, tensions simmered. The threat of Muslim counterattack was ever present. Internal rivalries and power struggles between the Frankish nobles often threatened to tear the fragile kingdom apart. Into this world of clashing cultures and constant danger was born Baldwin IV. He inherited the throne in 1174 at the tender age of 13, already marked by a cruel twist of fate. Leprosy, a disease shrouded in fear and misunderstanding, had begun to ravage his young body. Among the myriad confrontations that shaped the Crusades, the struggle between Baldwin IV of Jerusalem and Saladin, the powerful Muslim leader who united the Islamic world against the Franks, stands out as one of the most dynamic, emotionally charged, and narratively rich episodes in the entire saga. Their rivalry wasn't merely a matter of military campaigns or territorial disputes. It encapsulated the ideological clash of Christianity and Islam, the geopolitical tensions of the medieval Near East, and the personal drama of two leaders bound by duty, faith, and destiny. Baldwin's reign would be one of constant struggle, not just against the ever-present threat of Saladin, but also against his own debilitating illness. Yet, despite these challenges, Baldwin would prove to be a remarkable king. A brilliant military strategist, a wise and compassionate ruler, he would lead his kingdom through some of its most perilous years, defying all odds and becoming a legend in his own lifetime. This is the story of the Leper King, Baldwin IV, a boy who inherited a kingdom and faced a destiny far greater than anyone could have imagined. Baldwin IV's story begins not as a king, but as a boy in the court of Jerusalem, seemingly healthy, intelligent, and full of promise. He was born in 1161 to King Amalric I of Jerusalem and Queen Agnes of Courtenay, a high-ranking noble family within the Crusader state. His early years were shaped by both privilege and precarity, as the Kingdom of Jerusalem faced political instability and looming threats from its Muslim neighbours. Yet it was his education, under the renowned scholar and historian William of Tyre, that would both define and reveal the tragedy that would shape Baldwin's life. William, who would later serve as the kingdom's archbishop and chronicler, described young Baldwin as exceptionally bright and quick-witted. However, he also noticed something deeply troubling. The boy felt no pain in his right arm, despite being bitten and scratched during rough play with his peers. This lack of sensation was the first clear sign of Baldwin's affliction, leprosy, a disease that carried immense stigma and was often associated with divine punishment or moral failing. Despite the diagnosis, Baldwin's intelligence and composure impressed his tutors and the court. William of Tyre, in particular, recognized in him a seriousness and sense of responsibility rare for his age. When King Amalric died in 1174, the 13-year-old Baldwin was crowned King of Jerusalem. It was a moment of both symbolic and practical weight, a sickly adolescent assuming control of one of Christendom's most embattled outposts, facing pressures from both internal factions and a growing threat to the east in the form of Saladin. As Bernard Hamilton notes in The Leper King and His Heirs, Baldwin's early reign was dominated by regency arrangements due to his age. Initially, Raymond III of Tripoli was appointed regent, chosen largely for his political experience and ability to unite the barons. Yet Baldwin quickly demonstrated that he would not be a mere figurehead. By the age of 15, he took full control of the government, resisting manipulation and pushing back against powerful lords who sought to control him or the royal court. Baldwin's leprosy was not just a personal affliction, but a political one. The disease worsened over time, eventually rendering him unable to walk or use his hands. Yet in his early years on the throne, he rode into battle, led diplomatic efforts, and managed a realm filled with volatile personalities and delicate alliances. His courage in the face of physical deterioration earned him the loyalty of many and the admiration of contemporaries and chroniclers alike. Baldwin's ability to govern effectively, despite his illness, reshaped contemporary perceptions of kingship. In a society where physical prowess and battlefield heroism were often prerequisites for legitimacy, Baldwin redefined what it meant to be a ruler. He governed with clarity and strategic insight, often anticipating Saladin's moves and orchestrating defensive campaigns that kept the kingdom intact despite immense odds. His early reign also set the stage for the kingdom's internal tensions. Baldwin had to navigate disputes between powerful noble families, tensions with the church, and the competing ambitions of European powers whose involvement in the Holy Land could be both a blessing and a curse. His reign showed a rare balance of firmness and pragmatism. Even as his health declined, his grip on the kingdom remained steady. In many ways, Baldwin IV's early reign is not a story of decline but of defiance. It was a time when a boy, burdened by a disease that should have disqualified him from power, rose to lead a kingdom under siege. His actions during these formative years would not only delay the fall of Jerusalem, but set the tone for the kingdom's resistance against Saladin. The rise of Saladin was neither sudden nor accidental. It was the result of political acuity, religious legitimacy, and cautious ambition. Born in Tikrit in 1137 to a Kurdish family, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub came of age in a world where the Islamic Near East was fractured and fatigued. The once mighty Seljuk Empire was in decline, Muslim rulers quarreled over territory, and the Crusader states had embedded themselves into the Levantine coast for nearly a century. Into this chaos, Saladin stepped with a mission that would eventually reshape the region. Saladin's early career was shaped under the patronage of Nur ad-Din, the Zengid ruler of Aleppo and Damascus. Nur ad-Din, a committed Sunni Muslim and reformer, envisioned a unified Muslim front against the Latin Christians. In 1164, Saladin followed his uncle Shirkuh, a general in Nur ad-Din's service, on military campaigns into Egypt. The Fatimid Caliphate, which had ruled Egypt for centuries, was in political decline and vulnerable to both internal dissent and external manipulation. The Crusaders, Nur ad-Din, and Byzantine agents all vied for influence in the region. Shirkuh emerged victorious in this contest, seizing control of Cairo in 1169. Upon his death, Saladin was unexpectedly named vizier, a shocking decision, given his relatively young age and lack of independent power. Yet it was this moment that marked the beginning of his transformation from general to statesman. Once in power, Saladin moved quickly to consolidate his position. He retained the formal structures of the Fatimid government, but staffed key offices with loyal Sunni supporters, gradually eroding Shia influence. Saladin's great strategic pivot came in 1171. With Nur ad-Din's approval, he officially abolished the Fatimid Caliphate, declaring allegiance to the Sunni Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. This move eliminated the Shia challenge to Sunni orthodoxy in Egypt and aligned him ideologically with the dominant Sunni narrative sweeping through Syria and Mesopotamia. Saladin was no longer merely Nur ad-Din's lieutenant. He was now the steward of a crucial Islamic heartland. However, his relationship with Nur ad-Din grew strained. The Zengid ruler, who had initially seen Saladin as a subordinate, now feared his growing independence. Tensions between the two escalated, but Nur ad-Din's death in 1174 removed the immediate threat. This opened the door for Saladin to act. With remarkable speed and strategic patience, he began expanding into Syria under the pretext of protecting Nur ad-Din's heir. Saladin's conquest of Damascus in 1174 was a critical turning point. Unlike many conquerors, he entered the city with minimal bloodshed, positioning himself as a restorer of order and piety. Over the next few years, he extended his control over Hama, Homs, and eventually Aleppo, effectively uniting much of Syria under his leadership. This territorial consolidation wasn't merely military, it was deeply ideological. Saladin presented himself as a servant of Islam, committed to the cause of jihad against the Crusaders. John Mann, in Saladin, The Life, the Legend, and the Islamic Empire, notes that Saladin's religious image was central to his legitimacy. He built schools, mosques, and sponsored scholars. By championing Sunni orthodoxy and casting the conflict with the Crusaders as a righteous struggle, he transformed political ambition into a holy cause. This moral framing elevated him above mere dynastic rivalries, making him the embodiment of Islamic resistance. Stanley Lane Poole echoes this theme in Saladin and the Fall of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, highlighting how Saladin carefully cultivated his image. He was generous to the poor, tolerant of religious minorities, and known for acts of personal humility. These traits earned him admiration, even among his Christian enemies. Yet behind this image was a leader of unrelenting determination. His ultimate aim was to take Jerusalem, the symbolic heart of the Crusader presence, and expel the Franks from the Holy Land entirely. By the late 1170s, Saladin had forged a formidable state, the Ayyubid Sultanate, stretching from Egypt through Syria and into parts of Mesopotamia. He was now in a position to challenge the Crusader states, not just with force, but with ideological and material superiority. His army was larger, his authority more centralized, and his cause more unifying than anything the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem could muster. Saladin's rise wasn't just a change in political leadership, it was a transformation in the balance of power in the Near East. He brought together a patchwork of Muslim territories under one banner, offering a credible and inspiring alternative to the divided and often corrupt rule of the Crusader kingdoms. The next phase of his campaign would bring him into direct confrontation with Baldwin IV, whose resistance would be tested by the growing might of Saladin's empire. By late 1177, Baldwin IV, though just 16, was already weighed down by the burden of kingship and the cruel effects of leprosy. He had known from childhood that his affliction would grow worse with time. Yet it had not stopped him from taking the throne or asserting his authority. What he lacked in physical strength, he compensated for with intellect, resolve, and a commanding presence that inspired loyalty from even the most skeptical nobles in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. By then, Saladin had already established himself as a formidable adversary. After taking control of Egypt and expanding his influence over Syria, Saladin was on the rise as the champion of Muslim resistance against the Crusaders. There was a large Crusader expedition from Europe in the kingdom at the time, led by Philip of Alsace, the Count of Flanders. But Philip was preoccupied with the city of Harim and Hama in northern Syria. There were only a few knights left in the kingdom. So Saladin seized the opportunity and brought his army from Egypt into the Kingdom of Jerusalem in October, and encountered very little resistance in the southern part of the kingdom. Learning of Saladin's plans, Baldwin left Jerusalem with, according to William of Tyre, only 375 knights to attempt a defense at Ascalon. When he reached Ascalon, Baldwin issued the Heir ban. This obligation for all able-bodied men to serve in the military was rarely enforced, and its use is an index of how desperate the situation appeared to be. Knowing that Crusader forces were reduced, Saladin moved at a relaxed pace up the coast into Palestine, ravaging and burning farmland and collecting booty. In the fortress of Gaza, Grand Master Odo of Saint-Amand gathers the Knights Templar within their stronghold and defends his position. However, Saladin opts to skirt around the Templar fortress and presses forward toward Ascalon. One knight is more eager to defeat Saladin, Reynald de Chatillon, Lord of Outre-Jourdain, who had just been released from captivity in Aleppo in 1176. Reynald was a fierce enemy of Saladin and was King Baldwin's second in command. However, due to Baldwin's condition, the Frankish forces were physically led by Reynald. The Saladin army came into view, and Reynald realized how hopelessly outnumbered they were, and soon withdrew into the city again. Saladin considered that the royal army posed no threat, and determined to leave it in his rear and to march straight on to Jerusalem. As Saladin's troops scattered to plunder the fertile coastal regions, they met parties of men hurrying on foot to join the king at Ascalon in obedience to the Heir ban. They were taken prisoner and strapped to camels in Saladin's baggage train to be sold as slaves. They raided Ramla, Lydda and Mirabel, among other places. Jerusalem had not been threatened for decades. Its walls were in disrepair, and the terrified population sought refuge in the Tower of David. He also didn't leave anyone behind to guard Ascalon, either to prevent Baldwin from marching out again, or even just to report back to him if Baldwin left. Bernard Hamilton calls this an elementary lack of caution. Baldwin did indeed leave Ascalon and brought the army to Gaza, where they were joined by the Knights Templar. On November 25th, they tracked down the Sultan and his main army that had reached the hill of Montgisard, or Tel Jaza. Saladin's army was still widely dispersed and pillaging the surrounding land, and he could only recall the ones who were still within earshot. Consequently, he lost the advantage of overwhelmingly superior numbers, though he still had a larger force than the Franks, whose army consisted of 375 knights and a few thousands infantry. What the Saracens also failed to realize was they had been carefully maneuvered onto swampy ground, where superior numbers acted against them. The local knowledge of the ground is likely attributed to Lord Iblin. As Baldwin's army looked upon Saladin's, the king summoned the Bishop of Bethlehem to ride forward. The Crusaders had with them their most precious relic, the true cross, believed to be wood from the very cross of Jesus carried by the bishop. The king, whose teenage body was already ravaged by aggressive leprosy, was helped from his horse and dropped to his knees before the cross. He prayed to God for victory and rose to his feet to cheers from his men, who were moved and deeply inspired by what they had just witnessed.
I am Jerusalem.
Forming for battle, Baldwin, Reynald's Knights and the Templars, even though numerically inferior, executed a full frontal heavy armoured cavalry charge at the centre of Saladin's hurriedly formed battle lines, immediately inflicting heavy casualties. The impact was immediate and devastating, creating a wedge, breaking the enemy formation. Saladin's troops were spread out over a large area. He was trying to organise them into 3 or 4 blocks around the hill, and Reynald surprised him with a charge. A common tactic was to allow the Crusaders to charge, then manoeuvre the troops out of the way to almost let them pass through, but then surround and trap them. Saladin could have been planning to do that. Unfortunately for him, Reynald charged unexpectedly, before Saladin had put all his remaining troops where he needed them. Saladin's army simply lost their formation, and the Crusader army chased them. One of Saladin's great-nephews was killed, and Saladin himself was nearly killed, but he managed to escape mounting a racing camel and rushing away to safety with only a few companions. Crusaders chased down the fleeing enemy, killed or captured as many of them as they could, and also captured a large amount of booty. The Muslim troops that had previously wandered off to plunder the land were also easily captured when they tried to return. The pursuit lasted into the night. Hundreds of the remnants of Saladin's army captured by the Crusaders, who were surveying the area uninterested in forgiveness. Baldwin pursued Saladin until nightfall and then retired to Ascalon. Deluged by 10 days of heavy rains and suffering the loss of his army, including his personal bodyguard of Mamluks, Saladin fled back to Egypt, harassed by Bedouins along the way. Only 1/10 of his army made it back to Egypt with him. The loss of thousands of soldiers and the psychological blow of defeat shocked the Muslim world. In Egypt, rumors spread quickly. Was Saladin truly the chosen leader of jihad, or had he overreached? His critics within the Muslim world used the defeat to question his leadership. Yet Saladin, ever the pragmatist, responded with determination. He doubled down on reforms, strengthening his military infrastructure and ensuring that such a blunder would not be repeated. In the years that followed, he would focus on building reliable supply chains, improving discipline within his armies, and carefully planning his incursions. Montgisard became a bitter lesson, but also a catalyst for growth. On the Crusader side, Baldwin IV's status was transformed. Montgisard became not just a military victory, but a symbol of divine vindication. Here was a Leper King, disfigured and dying, who had faced the greatest general of the Muslim world and emerged victorious. The relic of the true cross, believed by many to have conferred God's blessing upon the army, was paraded through Jerusalem in triumph. Chroniclers recorded the victory with reverence, and Baldwin's popularity soared. Nevertheless, the king remained painfully aware that the triumph was temporary. He knew Saladin would regroup, that more battles loomed, and that his own time was running out. The victory bought Jerusalem time, but not safety. Baldwin continued to govern with resolve, seeking to strengthen his kingdom's alliances and manage its internal divisions. He worked to secure the succession and protect the realm from political collapse after his death. Following his triumphant stand at Montgisard, Baldwin IV experienced a surge in prestige and confidence. Yet the fundamental weaknesses of the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem remained unresolved. Political divisions festered among the barons, Baldwin's leprosy continued to deteriorate, and Saladin was learning fast from his earlier failure. Less than 2 years after his humiliating defeat, Saladin was planning his revenge. Saladin's strategy shifted in the aftermath of Montgisard. No longer would he risk a deep push into Crusader territory with unprotected flanks or scattered forces. Instead, he began conducting raids that served multiple purposes: testing Crusader defenses, gathering supplies, and demoralizing local populations. In early 1179, his forces began harassing Christian settlements near Sidon and the Jordan Valley, drawing the attention of Baldwin and his commanders. Baldwin, eager to confront the invaders and perhaps replicate his earlier success, set out with a mobile force. Among those who joined him were key nobles and military orders, including the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller. This campaign, however, lacked the surprise and cohesion of Montgisard. The Crusader army, while formidable on paper, was stretched thin and lacked reliable intelligence. The battlefield at Marj Ayyun, located near the present-day village of Ayyun in southern Lebanon, offered little advantage to Baldwin's troops. Saladin, well-informed and strategically patient, had anticipated their movements and prepared a trap. According to Stanley Lane Poole, Saladin had established forward positions to lure the Crusaders in and launched a devastating cavalry ambush when they advanced into unfavorable terrain. The result was disastrous for the Latin kingdom. The Crusaders were caught in confusion, their forces fragmented and uncoordinated. The Muslim cavalry, better adapted to the terrain and employing more fluid maneuvers, quickly overwhelmed the Frankish forces. Many knights were killed in the melee, while others were captured, including Odo of Saint-Amand, the Templar Grand Master, whose absence would deeply impact the order's leadership and morale. Baldwin himself narrowly escaped the battlefield, reportedly carried away on horseback by his retainers. The retreat was chaotic and humiliating. Unlike Montgisard, where Baldwin had projected strength and defiance, Marj Ayyun showcased his vulnerability, not just physical, but strategic. His army had walked into a prepared battlefield with insufficient planning and paid the price. Bernard Hamilton, in The Leper King and His Heirs, notes that this defeat marked a psychological blow to Baldwin's authority. While the king still commanded respect, doubts began to surface among his allies. Could he still lead the kingdom effectively as his illness worsened? Was Jerusalem prepared for Saladin's next phase of attacks, which now seemed more deliberate and relentless than ever? Indeed, Marj Ayyun proved to be a harbinger of Saladin's growing confidence and military refinement. It demonstrated that he had internalized the lessons of Montgisard. Never underestimate the Crusaders. Always prepare the terrain and strike where and when your enemy is least ready. The battle also underscored the increasing limitations of Crusader warfare. Their heavy cavalry was devastating in direct assaults, but vulnerable in unfamiliar landscapes, particularly when surprise and maneuverability came into play. In the months following the defeat, the Crusader leadership struggled to recover. Castles and border fortresses were reinforced, and appeals for help were sent to Europe, but the sense of unease persisted. Baldwin IV, now visibly more debilitated by leprosy, began to shift more responsibility to trusted advisors. While he remained politically sharp, his ability to lead troops in person diminished rapidly. Saladin, emboldened by the success at Marj Ayyun, continued his campaign of attrition. His raids became more frequent, and his troops began targeting fortified positions with greater confidence. He would soon focus his attention on one of the Crusaders' most ambitious military constructions, Jacob's Ford, a move that would further erode the kingdom's stability. Jacob's Ford, or Vadam Jacob, was located along the upper Jordan River, guarding a key crossing between the Galilee and Damascus. Recognizing the growing threat of Saladin's ambitions and the need to control access points into the kingdom, Baldwin IV ordered the construction of a fortress at this vital site in 1178. Built by the Knights Templar with the support of Baldwin's treasury, the fort was meant to challenge Saladin's hold on Damascus directly. David Nicol, in Crusader warfare, notes that the decision to build a Jacob's Ford was both bold and provocative. Its location placed it dangerously close to Saladin's Syrian domains. For the Crusaders, it was a symbol of renewed confidence and defiance after Montgisard. For Saladin, however, it was an intolerable threat, an armed presence too close for comfort. Saladin initially tried diplomacy. According to Amin Malouf in the Crusades Through Arab Eyes, he offered Baldwin substantial sums, some sources say up to 60,000 dinars, to halt the construction. Baldwin refused. The decision was emblematic of Baldwin's character: stubborn, unyielding, and deeply committed to the defense of his kingdom, even at great risk. By mid-1179, construction of the fortress was nearing completion. Saladin, realizing that time was against him, mobilized his forces and marched north from Damascus. His army was well equipped and included siege engineers, archers, infantry, and cavalry. In August, he arrived at the site and surrounded the fortress. The defenders, primarily Templars under the command of Brother Odo of Saint-Amand, braced for an attack. The siege was brutal. Saladin's engineers constructed siege towers, battering rams, and tunnels to undermine the walls. The Crusaders, caught off guard by the speed of Saladin's advance, were not fully prepared. Supplies were limited, and reinforcements were slow to arrive. For several days, Saladin's forces bombarded the walls and launched wave after wave of assaults. Eventually, the outer defenses were breached. The final blow came when Saladin's men managed to collapse a section of the wall through mining operations. The Muslim army poured into the fortress, overwhelming the garrison. The defenders fought with desperation, but they were too few. Contemporary Muslim sources describe the aftermath as a massacre. While some prisoners were taken, many were executed, especially the Templars, who were seen as fanatical and uncompromising foes. The fall of Jacob's Ford had immediate and lasting consequences. From a military standpoint, it removed a major threat to Saladin's Syrian heartland. The route from Damascus into Galilee was once again secure, and the psychological blow to the Crusaders was immense. A fortress that had cost considerable resources and was meant to project strength had instead become a ruin within a year of its construction. Christopher Tyerman, in God's War, emphasizes the symbolic dimension of the loss. Jacob's Ford had been a statement of Crusader resilience, an attempt to go on the offensive after years of mostly defensive warfare. Its destruction underscored the fragility of Crusader fortifications when confronted by a well-resourced opponent. More importantly, it demonstrated Saladin's ability to strike swiftly and decisively, using siege warfare to erode the Crusader presence. The defeat also exacerbated political tensions within the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The loss of so many Templars raised questions about their strategies, while Baldwin's refusal of Saladin's offer, once seen as noble, now appeared reckless to some. The king, whose health was visibly deteriorating, had fewer options left. Each loss made it harder to maintain morale, rally troops, or secure funding from Europe. For Saladin, the siege was a resounding success. It enhanced his reputation not just as a field commander, but as a master of sieges. His mercy towards certain prisoners, contrasted with the harsh treatment of Templars, also allowed him to portray himself as a just ruler, reinforcing his moral and religious authority across the Islamic world. He returned to Damascus hailed as a hero, with new momentum for future campaigns. Following the loss at Jacob's Ford, the Kingdom of Jerusalem found itself increasingly under pressure. Morale was faltering, fortifications were weakened, and Saladin's prestige was steadily rising. Yet amidst these ominous signs, Baldwin IV once again demonstrated remarkable resolve. Though now severely impaired by leprosy, nearly blind, unable to walk, and reliant on aids for even the most basic movement, he remained the spiritual and strategic leader of his realm. By this time, Saladin's campaigns had become increasingly aggressive. In late summer 1182, he launched another incursion into Crusader territory, aiming to raid the Galilee and pressure key strongholds. The Sultan hoped that continued military harassment would exhaust the Crusaders' resources and resolve. Baldwin, recognizing the threat, once again rallied his forces. The army he led into the field included many of the kingdom's most important nobles and knights, as well as troops from the military orders. The confrontation took place near a wooded area known as Forbelet, located in the highlands between Beirut and Galilee. Saladin's forces had entered Crusader lands with the intention of drawing the Christians into an unfavorable battle. However, Baldwin, still shrewd in strategy, anticipated this and maneuvered his army to prevent a complete tactical surprise. John Mann, in Saladin, The Life, the Legend, and the Islamic Empire, explains that this was not a battle of sweeping maneuvers or grand charges. Rather, it was a grinding clash of lines in difficult terrain, with both sides struggling for positional advantage. Saladin attempted to outflank the Crusader army using his lighter cavalry, but Baldwin's commanders held firm. Despite being physically unable to lead from the front, Baldwin maintained command from a litter carried by his knights, issuing orders through his generals. According to Thomas Asbridge, the battle ultimately resulted in a stalemate. Saladin failed to achieve his goals and withdrew his forces, unable to deliver a decisive blow. While the Crusaders held the field, they lacked the strength to pursue, and the cost of the engagement, especially in terms of provisions and fatigue, was high. Yet for Baldwin, the result was a small but meaningful victory. He had proven that Jerusalem could still resist. The deeper significance of Le Forbelet lies in its symbolism. At a time when Baldwin could barely lift a sword, he still placed himself at the heart of the kingdom's defense. His presence on the battlefield, even from a litter, galvanized his troops and reinforced the legitimacy of his kingship. The Christian soldiers, seeing their leprous king endure unimaginable pain to lead them, fought with renewed determination. This engagement also highlighted Saladin's calculated approach. Unlike Montgisard, where overconfidence led to disaster, Saladin fought cautiously. He was willing to retreat and regroup, preferring long-term erosion over short-term risk. His inability to break the Crusader lines did little to deter his overall campaign strategy, which remained focused on wearing down the kingdom over time. As Baldwin IV's health deteriorated beyond recovery in the early 1880s, the Kingdom of Jerusalem entered a prolonged period of deep political instability. The young king, once a symbol of courage and strategic acumen, could no longer ride into battle or consistently administer the realm. Though his mind remained sharp and his political instincts as incisive as ever, his physical condition had declined so severely that he was blind, immobile, and utterly dependent on a coterie of loyal courtiers and nobles. The growing crisis over the line of succession, exacerbated by bitter factionalism, began to erode the already fragile cohesion of the Crusader state. By 1183, Baldwin had grown acutely aware that his reign was drawing to a close. He had no direct heirs, and the next plausible candidate was his nephew, Baldwin V, the child of his sister Sibylla, and her first husband, William Longsword, who passed away in April 1777. The legitimacy of this future succession, however, was hotly contested. Though Baldwin V's royal blood was not in question, the young boy's age and vulnerability posed serious concerns. More divisive still was the looming influence of Sibylla's second husband, Guy de Lusignan, a man many in the kingdom considered arrogant, inexperienced, and untrustworthy. Initially, Baldwin IV appointed Guy de Lusignan as regent, a decision shaped partly by dynastic necessity and partly by the hope that a marriage alliance might calm the growing rifts within the nobility. At first, this seemed like a politically sound decision. He had a respectable lineage and the endorsement of Sibylla, a key figure in the royal family. But it quickly became apparent that he lacked the leadership qualities necessary to manage the delicate balance of power in Jerusalem. Balian of Ibelin, one of the most influential lords in the kingdom and a respected military leader, emerged as Guy de Lusignan's most visible rival. His support came not only from powerful noble families, but also from members of the clergy and even some military orders. The result was a rapidly polarizing political landscape. Factions loyal to Guy de Lusignan, many of whom saw his marriage to Sibylla as a guarantee of continuity, clashed with those backing Balian and the Ibelins, who viewed Guy de Lusignan as a potential disaster. Bernard Hamilton, in The Leper King and His Heirs, underscores Baldwin IV's personal distress at the situation. Though he had originally supported the marriage between Sibylla and Guy de Lusignan, believing it would strengthen royal authority, Baldwin was soon forced to reckon with his evident failures in both diplomacy and military leadership. Matters came to a head during Saladin's siege of Kerak in 1183. Guy de Lusignan, as regent, had the responsibility of coordinating the kingdom's defense, but his hesitant response was widely criticized. Baldwin, gravely ill but unwilling to abandon his people, had himself carried to the front lines. His symbolic presence helped lift the siege, but his confidence in Guy de Lusignan was destroyed. This episode compelled Baldwin to remove him from power and pursue an alternative strategy. He had his young nephew crowned as co-king, Baldwin V, in an effort to secure the succession through legitimacy rather than marriage alliance. It was a bold move. The image of the Leper King standing alongside the child monarch was a dramatic display of continuity and intent. But this act also required a new regent. Baldwin IV turned to Count Raymond III of Tripoli, a seasoned and politically astute nobleman who had served the kingdom in previous decades. Christopher Tyerman, in God's War, notes that Raymond's appointment was both logical and incendiary. Though respected for his administrative capabilities, Raymond was deeply mistrusted by some factions, especially those close to Sibylla. Rumors abound that Raymond harbored ambitions for the throne himself, or sought to control the young king to serve his own ends. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Sibylla and her supporters, including many knights, Templars, and Italian merchants, began to maneuver for Guy de Lusignan's restoration. By 1185, Baldwin IV was no longer capable of active rule. He formally abdicated and withdrew from court life, retreating to hospice care. Baldwin V, barely 8 years old, was now the symbolic ruler of a deeply fragmented kingdom. Real authority devolved to a regency council where every decision was contested. The Crusader elite, already notorious for internal disputes, fractured further. The military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, divided their allegiances. Economic players like the Genoese and Pisan merchants shifted their support according to their interests. With Baldwin IV sidelined, tensions continued to mount. The regency, under Raymond of Tripoli, functioned only with great difficulty. Sibylla and her supporters never ceased pushing for Guy de Lusignan's return to power. Attempts to build consensus among the barons routinely failed. Diplomatic overtures to the west were met with lukewarm responses, as foreign rulers remained skeptical of the Latin kingdom's political health. Meanwhile, Saladin kept close watch on these developments. He continued to build alliances with other Muslim rulers, consolidate his territorial holdings, and prepare for what he hoped would be a final decisive campaign. Every whisper of discord within Jerusalem was relayed back to Damascus and Cairo, confirming what Saladin had long anticipated, that the Christian kingdom was tearing itself apart. Internally, the situation was no better. Even as Baldwin IV clung to his administrative functions, the atmosphere in Jerusalem grew more unstable. Royal edicts were contested, supplies to the northern frontiers grew scarce, and the church struggled to maintain neutrality as bishops and abbots picked sides in the succession dispute. Trade slowed, recruitment waned, and morale among the citizenry faltered. Nobles who once pledged unity under Baldwin's banner now eyed each other with suspicion. Baldwin IV's greatest adversary was not Saladin, but the internal disunity of his own realm. His foresight in trying to establish a stable succession, his sacrifices to preserve the kingdom's dignity, and his efforts to govern from a state of constant pain were heroic. But the ambition of lesser men and the short-sightedness of factions threatened to undo much of his work. The political chaos that reached its height during his final years became a sign of the coming catastrophe. Baldwin IV died in 1185 at the age of 24, after nearly a decade of battling both leprosy and the mounting crises of his kingdom. His death marked not only the end of a remarkable reign, but the beginning of a rapid and irreversible decline in the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem's political cohesion and military readiness. Though Baldwin had spent his final years attempting to establish a stable succession and preserve unity, the efforts unraveled quickly under the weight of ambition and mistrust. Baldwin's reign was legendary not only for his strategic intelligence and battlefield courage, but for the dignity and determination with which he carried out his duties while battling a disfiguring and debilitating illness. His leadership was a beacon in an era of turmoil. Respected by both allies and enemies, he proved that a true king ruled not with strength of body, but with clarity of purpose and strength of spirit. Upon Baldwin IV's death, the throne passed to his young nephew, Baldwin V. The child king was only 8 years old, and though he had been crowned co-ruler during Baldwin IV's lifetime, his ascension marked a delicate transitional moment. The regency fell to Count Raymond III of Tripoli, a veteran noble and respected diplomat, albeit one whose loyalties were often questioned. While Raymond was cautious and pragmatic, his style of governance lacked the charismatic authority Baldwin IV had wielded even from a litter. For a brief period, the regency under Raymond preserved the appearance of order. Baldwin V remained a figurehead, while decisions were handled by a council of nobles. However, this fragile equilibrium quickly collapsed when Baldwin V died suddenly in 1186. The cause of his death remains unknown, though suspicions of poisoning circulated in the court. What mattered more than the cause was the vacuum it created, one that would be filled not by consensus, but by a political coup. Sibylla, mother of Baldwin V and sister to Baldwin IV, seized the moment. Supported by a faction of nobles and influential clergymen, she claimed the crown for herself. In a move both shrewd and controversial, she agreed to set aside her husband, Guy de Lusignan, if allowed to rule. After securing the crown, she promptly reinstated Guy de Lusignan as king consort, betraying her promise and triggering outrage among the barons. Many nobles, especially those aligned with the Ibelin family, saw his return as a disaster. Baldwin IV had previously stripped him of the regency for incompetence. Now, through a legal technicality and family maneuvering, he was back on the throne. The kingdom split into factions once again. Balian of Ibelin and Raymond of Tripoli considered crowning an alternative monarch, Isabella, Sibylla's half-sister, who also had a legitimate claim. Though a full-blown civil war was averted, thanks in part to Saladin's looming threat, the damage to internal unity was done. Guy de Lusignan's leadership soon proved every bit as unstable as his critics feared. He lacked military experience, strategic insight, and political tact, whereas Baldwin IV had carefully navigated a court full of competing interests. Guy de Lusignan alienated key allies and failed to command respect from the baronial elite. His decisions increasingly isolated the monarchy and undermined trust in the royal court. One of his most damaging errors was his handling of relations with Raymond of Tripoli. Though Raymond had been regent and remained an influential noble, Guy de Lusignan viewed him with suspicion. Instead of reinforcing ties through diplomacy, he refused to renew Raymond's position of authority in Galilee and allowed tensions to escalate. Raymond, feeling betrayed, entered into a non-aggression pact with Saladin, a move that shocked the court and effectively opened the kingdom's eastern flank. Stanley Lane Poole, in Saladin and the Fall of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, argues that Guy de Lusignan's paranoia and pride weakened the Crusader state at a critical moment. His inability to bring Raymond back into the royal fold turned a respected commander into a reluctant rival. As a result, when Saladin began mobilizing his forces in 1187, the Latin kingdom was not only unprepared, but politically fractured. The deterioration of military coordination was stark. Local lords refused to follow royal orders, logistical planning was inconsistent, and morale was low. Guy de Lusignan attempted to rally the nobility by calling a general muster of the kingdom's forces, but the divisions within the military elite made unity difficult. Some commanders hesitated to cooperate. Others questioned Guy de Lusignan's strategic judgment altogether. Baldwin IV had used diplomacy as a force multiplier, building bridges with both the church and the barons. In contrast, Guy ruled through assertion rather than persuasion. His court grew isolated, while foreign envoys, including those from Europe, reported confusion and disorder in Jerusalem's capital. Appeals to the West for reinforcements received lukewarm responses. The Latin kingdom's plight, once the focus of Christian Europe, now appeared the consequence of its own ineptitude. Even within the military orders, long the backbone of Crusader defense, discontent brewed. The Templars, who had lost their Grand Master Odo of Saint-Amand years earlier, were wary of Guy's direction. The Hospitallers, too, expressed concern over the kingdom's leadership. Without unified command, Jerusalem's military became a patchwork of feuding commanders, each protecting their own interests. Meanwhile, Saladin was biding his time. He had secured alliances with key Muslim rulers and spent years preparing for a final confrontation with the Crusaders. The internal divisions he observed within Jerusalem confirmed what he had long suspected. The kingdom was ripe for invasion. Guy's leadership errors were compounded by his insistence on asserting royal authority through force rather than negotiation. When reports reached Jerusalem in early 1187 of Muslim forces raiding Galilee and threatening Christian settlements, Guy ordered the mustering of the full field army. Against the advice of seasoned nobles, he insisted on marching east to engage Saladin near the horns of Hattin. This decision would lead directly to catastrophe. But even before the fateful battle, Guy de Lusignan's tenure had already set the stage for disaster. His mismanagement of internal politics, disregard for experienced advisors, and failure to inspire confidence had left the kingdom vulnerable and divided. In the hands of Guy de Lusignan, what Baldwin had held together through sheer force of will began to unravel at a frightening pace. The storm that Baldwin had delayed now gathered force, and the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem stood exposed. Saladin had been preparing for this confrontation for years. Throughout the 1180s, he conducted a series of deliberate campaigns designed to test the Crusader response, undermine border security, and build up a unified front of Muslim resistance across the region. After years of smaller raids, negotiated truces, and isolated sieges, his objective was now fully crystallized: to cripple the Crusader military leadership in a single overwhelming blow. With the Latin kingdom weakened by internal rivalries and placed in the uncertain hands of Guy de Lusignan, unpopular, untested, and distrusted even by his own nobles, Saladin saw a rare opportunity to deal a decisive strike. In early 1187, Saladin summoned a great host from his territories in Egypt, Syria, and northern Mesopotamia. His forces included veteran cavalry, disciplined infantry, and contingents of tribal auxiliaries and allied emirs. This army was not a hastily assembled force. It was the product of careful planning, logistical preparation, and political consolidation. Saladin's role as both a religious and political leader enabled him to rally troops, not just through military command, but through the language of jihad and divine retribution. He portrayed the war as a righteous struggle to cleanse the Holy Land from foreign invaders. Meanwhile, the Crusader state remained politically fractured and militarily uncertain. Raymond of Tripoli, once regent under Baldwin IV and a respected strategist, had grown increasingly estranged from the court under Guy de Lusignan's leadership. Raymond entered into a truce with Saladin, allowing Muslim scouts and raiders to traverse Galilee unchallenged. This agreement, born of political spite and defensive calculation, ultimately gave Saladin a clear path to launch his campaign. In early July, Saladin's army struck at the fortress town of Tiberias on the western edge of the Sea of Galilee. His siege was swift and strategic, designed not only to gain a foothold, but to provoke the Crusader leadership into a rash response. Inside the citadel was Eschiva of Bures, wife of Raymond of Tripoli. It was a calculated bait. Despite the personal stakes, Raymond advised against intervention. He recognized the tactical danger of leaving the defensible position at La Saforie and marching through parched and exposed terrain. Saladin had the advantage in both terrain and readiness, but Guy de Lusignan, pressured by his court and eager to assert authority, chose to override Raymond's counsel. In doing so, he played directly into Saladin's hands. On July 2nd, 1187, Guy de Lusignan ordered the entire Crusader host to march from their encampment at La Saforie toward Tiberias. This army, consisting of roughly 15,000 men, including 1,200 mounted knights, foot soldiers, and detachments from the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller, was the kingdom's last great field force. The decision to move the army was contentious from the start. The heat of midsummer was punishing, and the rocky, open terrain between La Saforie and Tiberias lacked natural cover, fresh water, and defensive depth. Despite repeated warnings from experienced commanders, including Raymond of Tripoli, Guy insisted on marching. He hoped to show resolve and seize the initiative, but this gamble betrayed a misunderstanding of both logistics and Saladin's tactical skill. The decision would cost him dearly. Saladin, anticipating such a reaction, had orchestrated an ingenious war of attrition. His scouts identified every well and spring on the Crusaders' route, which were then either destroyed, blocked, or heavily guarded. As the Christian host pressed forward, they encountered constant harassment from Saladin's light cavalry. Skirmishes, ambushes, and missile fire slowed their progress. The Crusaders were forced to march in tight, shielded formations, which added to the physical strain and reduced their maneuverability. By July 3rd, the Crusaders had made it only part-way to Tiberias. With their water reserves nearly gone and many men and horses collapsing from heat exhaustion, panic began to spread. Morale plummeted. Soldiers removed armor in desperation. The wounded were left behind. Guy's officers urged him to break through to the Sea of Galilee, where the army could regroup and resupply. But instead, Guy chose to camp near a series of extinct volcanic hills known as the Horns of Hattin. This decision, likely driven by exhaustion and poor intelligence, sealed the fate of his army. That night, Saladin's forces surrounded the Crusader encampment, cutting off escape routes and controlling the high ground. Campfires lit by the Muslims and burning brush filled the night air with smoke, worsening the dehydration and disorientation among the Crusaders. Trapped, exhausted, and nearly delirious, the Christian army waited helplessly for the dawn and Saladin's final strike. At dawn on July 4th, 1187, Saladin's army commenced its final assault. His troops, well rested and strategically positioned on the surrounding high ground, launched relentless volleys of arrows into the Crusader camp. These were not random salvos. Saladin's archers aimed with deadly discipline, systematically targeting the Crusader cavalry, supply wagons, and densely packed infantry formations. To compound the chaos, Saladin ordered his men to set fire to the dry brush surrounding the field. Smoke enveloped the Crusaders, choking their breath and impairing visibility, while the heat of the flames only worsened their thirst and confusion. The conditions within the Crusader ranks were nightmarish. Many soldiers, already suffering from dehydration and heatstroke, began to collapse before ever reaching the enemy. Some were too weak to stand, let alone fight. Horses dropped dead in their traces, and the wounded were trampled in the press of bodies. In desperation, the Crusaders formed tight circles around their standards, trying to shield their commanders and the relic of the true cross. Yet even this sacred symbol could not stem the tide. Several breakout attempts were made, including a daring charge by Raymond of Tripoli. Leading a detachment of mounted knights, Raymond managed to slice through a weak point in Saladin's lines and escape the battlefield, though only with a fraction of his men. Others were not so fortunate. The Knights Templar and Hospitaller, known for their discipline and religious zeal, fought with unmatched ferocity. Yet they were isolated and surrounded, slowly cut down by Saladin's more numerous and agile cavalry. Exhausted and leaderless, most of the Crusader contingents began to break apart under pressure. Guy de Lusignan, unable to rally his troops or organize an effective counterattack, was captured, along with many high-ranking nobles, including Renaud of Châtillon. The sacred relic of the True Cross, which had been carried onto the battlefield by the Bishop of Acre and guarded by a chosen group of knights, was seized by Saladin's troops. It would be paraded in Damascus as a symbol of divine favor. Its loss, devastating Christian morale across the kingdom. The collapse was total. The Crusader camp became a slaughterhouse. Bodies piled in heaps, armor scorched and bloodied. The defeat at Hattin was not just a loss, it was annihilation. The scale of the defeat was almost without precedent in the history of the Crusader states. Nearly the entire army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was either killed outright in battle or taken prisoner in the aftermath. Those who were captured, exhausted, and wounded were marched under heavy guard to Saladin's encampment, where the victors determined their fate. While King Guy de Lusignan and a small number of high-ranking nobles, such as Humphrey of Toron and Reynold of Sidon, were spared, held as valuable political pawns or potential bargaining chips, the same could not be said for the military orders. Among the prisoners were hundreds of knights from the orders of the Temple and the Hospital, men sworn to defend the Holy Land to the death. Saladin, viewing these warrior monks as implacable enemies of Islam, who would never accept truces or peace, ordered their execution. According to eyewitness accounts and Muslim chroniclers like Baha al-Din ibn Shaddad, Saladin personally observed as his Mamluks beheaded the Templars and Hospitallers one by one, beginning with their grand officers. The mass execution, carried out with grim efficiency, was intended not only to eliminate future threats, but to send a clear message. The age of Crusader supremacy in the East was over. Raymond of Tripoli's successful escape from the battlefield ensured that some military leadership survived. However, the broader impact of Hattin was the annihilation of Jerusalem's core military class. Knights, sergeants, archers and squires, men who had trained and fought for years, were gone in a single day. Their deaths or captivity left behind a kingdom virtually defenseless, its garrisons depleted and its field armies obliterated. The psychological toll was equally catastrophic. The loss of the true cross, the kingdom's most sacred relic, was perceived by many as a sign of divine disfavor. Carried into battle by the Bishop of Acre, the relic had served as a banner and spiritual anchor. Its capture and eventual parade through Damascus by Saladin's men was not only a religious humiliation, but a political one. The echoes of the disaster were soon felt far beyond the Levant. As word of the defeat spread through messengers and returning survivors, Europe erupted in alarm. Pope Urban III, residing in Ferrara at the time, is said by some sources to have died from the shock and grief upon hearing of Hattin. His successor, Gregory VIII, quickly issued a call for repentance and organized what would become the Third Crusade. Yet, despite the urgency, it would take time before new armies could be mobilized. Months passed, and during that interval, the Crusader states remained exposed and vulnerable. Panic swept through the coastal cities of Outremer as refugees poured in from the interior, spreading tales of massacre and ruin. The sense of catastrophe was not confined to the battlefield. For Latin Christians across Europe, the defeat at Hattin was an existential crisis. Sermons were delivered in cathedrals decrying the moral failings that had led to such judgment. Pilgrimages were interrupted. Monarchs and nobles reassessed their priorities, aware that Jerusalem, the holiest site in Christendom, was now in jeopardy. Hattin was not merely a defeat, it was an earthquake, shaking the very foundations of the crusading enterprise. Saladin had not only destroyed a Crusader army, he had crippled the entire infrastructure of resistance that Jerusalem and its satellite territories relied upon. Fortresses, once deemed unbreachable, were now manned by skeletal garrisons or abandoned altogether. Communication lines were severed, morale was shattered, and the network of alliances that had tenuously held the Crusader world together dissolved into panic and retreat. The few remaining commanders who had escaped the carnage, like Raymond of Tripoli and Balian of Ibelin, now faced the unenviable task of holding together a kingdom with no standing army, dwindling supplies, and no central authority capable of unifying what was left. With the king in captivity and most of the elite warrior class either dead or imprisoned, political power fell to whoever could rally a defense with what few men and resources remained. Towns and fortresses like Tyre, Ascalon, and Jaffa braced for the worst, scrambling to organize resistance in the face of Saladin's inevitable advance. Though a few fortresses did remain under Christian control, the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem was no longer a proactive force. It had become a reactive remnant, clinging to the edges of what was once a flourishing Crusader stronghold. The very character of the Crusader presence in the Levant shifted in the wake of Hattin. No longer a collection of proud lords with ambitions of conquest, it was now a refugee state, fragmented and barely surviving. The memory of the battle endured for generations. In the Islamic world, it was remembered as a divine victory, a moment when the true faith triumphed over the invader. Poets and chroniclers celebrated Saladin's wisdom, courage, and piety. His actions were framed as a fulfillment of religious destiny, an act of divine justice, restoring the balance of the Holy Land. In the Christian world, however, Hattin became a symbol of failure and self-destruction, a cautionary tale of infighting, poor leadership, and spiritual decay. The loss of the true cross especially haunted the medieval imagination. In the years that followed, preachers across Europe used the story of Hattin to call for repentance and renewal. It was said that the Crusaders were punished not by men, but by God. And so, as the smoke of Hattin cleared and the stunned survivors made their way to the few safe havens still under Latin control, a new reality dawned. The path to Jerusalem lay open, and the man who now stood poised to take it was no longer just a regional leader, but a symbol of unity and power in the Islamic world. What followed in the coming weeks would be no less dramatic, and would determine the fate of the holy city itself. In the wake of the crushing defeat at Hattin, the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem found itself in a state of total disarray. With its army destroyed, its king in captivity, and its nobility either dead, captured, or scattered, the Crusader state no longer had the means to defend its greatest prize, the holy city of Jerusalem. What followed in the ensuing weeks was not only a military maneuver, but a profound spiritual and psychological reckoning for both Muslims and Christians alike. Saladin, following his great triumph, did not immediately march on Jerusalem. Instead, he carefully and systematically secured control over Galilee, Acre, Nazareth, and other major towns in northern and central Palestine. Fortresses surrendered with little resistance. Cities opened their gates rather than face the same fate as Hattin. The shockwaves from the battle had broken the backbone of Crusader resistance. Saladin's reputation now loomed over every garrison and town. His military genius, personal piety, and clemency stood in contrast to the brutality many feared. Jerusalem, however, was different. This was no outpost. It was the spiritual capital of Christendom in the East, the city for which the First Crusade had been launched. Its fall would not only be a strategic loss, but a devastating symbol. It would mark the undoing of nearly a century of Christian presence in the Holy Land. For Saladin, retaking Jerusalem had both political and religious significance. He saw himself as a restorer of faith and justice. But he also knew the city had to fall in a manner that preserved its sanctity. Inside the city, chaos reigned. After Hattin, many residents, especially women and children, fled from surrounding towns to seek refuge within Jerusalem's walls. The city, once home to around 20,000 residents, swelled with refugees. The defenses, however, were pitiful. The bulk of the garrison had perished at Hattin. The city lacked seasoned soldiers, supplies were short, and panic was widespread. Incredibly, it fell to Balian of Ibelin, a noble who had survived Hattin and initially sought safe passage to evacuate his family, to take up the city's defense. Saladin granted Balian permission to enter Jerusalem under the condition that he would not bear arms. But once inside and seeing the desperation of the people, Balian felt compelled to break his oath. With the approval of the city's clergy, he assumed command. According to chroniclers, Balian knighted every able-bodied man over the age of 16 and organized the remnants of the Templars and Hospitallers who had not fought at Hattin. He coordinated what fortifications could be hastily repaired, distributed weapons, and arranged civilian defenses. It was a valiant, if desperate, attempt to delay the inevitable. Saladin approached Jerusalem in late September 1187, commanding a disciplined and highly motivated army that had gained considerable experience in siege warfare over the past months. His forces, numbering in the tens of thousands, included siege engineers, archers, cavalry, and infantry drawn from across the Ayyubid Empire. They surrounded the city on all sides, effectively cutting off all avenues for reinforcements or escape. The Crusader defenders inside the city, led by Balian of Ibelin, faced a terrifyingly uneven match, not only in numbers, but in morale, provisions, and military equipment. The siege, began in earnest. Saladin ordered continuous bombardments using mangonels and trebuchets. Stones rained down on the walls day and night. Fire was used as a weapon of terror, with burning projectiles igniting towers and dwellings near the city perimeter. Saladin's engineers constructed siege towers, covered in hides soaked in vinegar to resist flames, which were pushed up against the walls to create multiple breaches. His men filled the air with war cries and drums, a psychological assault as much as a physical one, reminding the inhabitants that their hour was near. Despite overwhelming odds, Balian and the defenders fought back with unexpected resolve. Makeshift weapons were crafted for civilian defenders. Women carried stones and boiling oil to the ramparts. Clerics inspired the people with sermons of faith and martyrdom. Each attack was repelled with a fierce energy born of desperation. Yet the signs of collapse were everywhere. Food stores dwindled rapidly. Disease began to spread among the refugees, and the walls bore the scars of repeated strikes. The psychological weight on the civilian population was immense. Most had never experienced battle, and now found themselves trapped within the walls of a doomed city. Rumors of mass slaughter haunted the streets. Parents prepared their children for the worst. The defenders knew they could not hold indefinitely, but they hoped to secure a negotiated surrender that would save lives. Recognizing the inevitability of the city's fall, Balian sent envoys to Saladin requesting a parley. When the two men finally met, it was under solemn and fateful circumstances. Chroniclers described the meeting with reverence. Balian, gaunt and weary from days of combat, and Saladin, regal yet measured, confronted each other not as savages, but as leaders of civilizations. Balian pleaded for mercy for the civilians and the holy places. He warned that if the city was taken by storm, the defenders would destroy Jerusalem's sacred relics and sites, execute Muslim prisoners, and die fighting rather than submit. Saladin, a man who had long dreamed of restoring Jerusalem to Muslim hands, reiterated his desire to take the city without repeating the horror of 1099, when Crusaders had massacred the Muslim and Jewish populations upon seizing Jerusalem. In one of the most pivotal diplomatic exchanges of the Crusades, the two reached an accord. The city would surrender peacefully, and the Christian inhabitants would be allowed to buy their freedom. Those who could pay would be ransomed. Those who could not would be helped by the generosity of others, or by Saladin himself. It was a rare instance of compassion and pragmatism prevailing in an age of bitter religious warfare. According to the agreement, the citizens of Jerusalem would be allowed to leave safely upon the payment of a ransom. Those who could pay would buy their freedom. Saladin even offered generous terms, 10 dinars per man, 5 per woman, and 1 per child. Balian negotiated for the poor as well. Ultimately, Saladin agreed to release thousands of people who could not pay, covering their ransoms with his own treasury and those of his emirs. On October 2nd, 1187, the city gates were opened. The Muslim banners of Saladin's army rose above the walls. There was no sack, no massacre. Instead, the Christian population filed out in organized columns, escorted to coastal cities like Tyre and Tripoli. Muslim families who had been expelled during the First Crusade were allowed to return. The Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, long converted to Christian use, were purified and rededicated. The fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves through the Christian world. In Europe, news of the city's surrender caused widespread mourning and fury. The Third Crusade would soon be born from this moment. But even among some Christians, there was reluctant admiration for Saladin. He had taken the city with honor, not vengeance. Muslim chroniclers hailed the moment as the culmination of a holy struggle. Christian chroniclers, though bitter, could not deny the dignity with which Saladin treated his enemies. The conquest of Jerusalem marked a new chapter in the Crusades. The city, the prize of the First Crusade, had returned to Muslim control, but it had done so not through slaughter or treachery, but through negotiation, resilience, and a powerful sense of religious purpose on both sides. The Crusader spirit would not die, but it would never again dominate the Levant as it had before 1187. The story of King Baldwin IV and Saladin is one of the most compelling rivalries in medieval history, not merely for its military significance, but for the human, moral, and ideological dimensions it reflects. On one side stood a Christian king, young, dying, and disfigured, yet fiercely intelligent and courageous. On the other, a Muslim sultan, ascendant, strategic, and deeply devout. Their contest was not one of equals in health or resources, but it was one of equals in willpower, leadership, and historical consequence. Baldwin IV defied both his physical limitations and the expectations of his contemporaries. Diagnosed with leprosy in childhood, he could have been sidelined, pitied, or used as a symbolic figurehead. Instead, he emerged as one of the most capable rulers the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem would ever know. His victories, particularly at Montgisard, were not just tactical successes, they were symbols of defiance, of faith, and of moral resolve in the face of overwhelming odds. Even as his body failed him, Baldwin IV governed wisely. He managed volatile nobles, balanced church influence, and held at bay the growing tide of Saladin's empire. He repeatedly placed himself at the center of critical events, from leading armies in battle to crafting delicate diplomatic strategies. His efforts to secure a stable succession, while ultimately unsuccessful, reflected a clear understanding of the kingdom's fragility and his personal responsibility to preserve it. Saladin, by contrast, emerged from relative obscurity to become the unifier of the Islamic world. Through calculated warfare and skillful diplomacy, he transformed a fractured Muslim landscape into a formidable empire. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Saladin did not rely solely on brute force. He built his legitimacy through religious devotion, just governance, and battlefield victories that he framed as expressions of divine justice. What sets Saladin apart in history, particularly from the perspective of both Islamic and Christian chroniclers, is not just that he won, but how he did so. His conduct after battles, especially in the aftermath of Jerusalem's surrender, demonstrated a rare combination of magnanimity and discipline. He refused to allow a repeat of the massacres of the First Crusade, offering generous terms to his enemies and restoring the city's holy sites with reverence. Together, Baldwin and Saladin represented two models of leadership shaped by faith, adversity, and historical purpose. Baldwin ruled while dying, yet refused to allow his condition to weaken the resolve of his kingdom. Saladin ruled while rising, yet refused to let power corrupt his moral compass. Their rivalry, rather than being one of hatred, was one of mutual recognition. Each saw in the other a formidable opponent, not just in arms, but in principle. The fall of Jerusalem in 1187 was not just the end of a military campaign, it was the close of an era. It marked the final unraveling of the fragile structure Baldwin had worked so hard to sustain. Yet even in defeat, his memory endured. Chroniclers remembered him as the Leper King, who led with more valor and wisdom than many healthy monarchs. His personal tragedy became a source of legend, his courage a point of inspiration. Saladin's legacy, meanwhile, transcended borders. In the Islamic world, he was celebrated as a mujahid, a leader of holy war, and unifier of lands long divided. In the Christian world, despite being an enemy, he was admired, sometimes even romanticized, as the ideal of a chivalrous foe. Later generations of European writers would portray him as the model of the noble adversary, in contrast to the brutality often associated with their own side. Their lives were bound by a shared theatre of war, by a sacred geography, and by a respect for the stakes they both understood. Though they fought for opposing causes, they did so with a dignity that set them apart from the cruelty and chaos that often defined the Crusades. In remembering Baldwin IV and Saladin, we are reminded that history is not always written by the victors alone. It is written in the struggle, in the principles upheld, and in the legacy left behind. One man fought against time and illness, the other against division and complacency. Both, in their own way, achieved a kind of immortality. But as the dust settled over the battlefield, one question remained. Would Jerusalem ever know peace, or is it cursed to bleed until the end of time?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.